Hello everyone, welcome back to another Genshin Impact video. The god of animo himself, Venti, is finally getting another rerun, and I know that many players are currently wondering whether or not he's still worth pulling. When Genshin Impact first launched, Venti was one of the most overpowered characters in the game, but with the addition of Kazuha and the rise in popularity of Sucrose, many players are actually wondering whether or not he's still viable, and whether or not he's worth your primos. So today we're going to be reviewing his kit, his best weapons, his best artifacts, and team synergies, and then after reviewing everything, I'll try to give you guys my personal thoughts and whether or not I still think that he's relevant in today's current meta, so that you can know whether or not he's going to be a good fit for you based on what you already have and your personal preferences. Like always, if you do end up finding the video helpful at all, please feel free to leave me a like and comment down below. It really does help me boost into the YouTube algorithm and I'd greatly appreciate it. And if you want to see more Genshin Impact content from me, make sure to hit that subscribe button and click that notification bell. But with all that out of the way, let's get into the video. When Venti was first released all the way back in version 0.0, he was easily considered to be one of the best, if not the best character in Genshin Impact. But why was this the case? Well, when Genshin Impact launched, a lot of content was focused around fighting hordes of enemies. Whether it was in the overworld or in Spiral Abyss, Venti easily dominated at least 90% of all content, simply because of his insane crowd controlling mechanics. In fact, till this day, Venti is still the best crowd controller in Genshin Impact by a long shot. So whenever you're dealing with hordes of small enemies or enemies that can be picked up by his burst, Venti is always going to be the clear pick. However, as the game has progressed, Venti has been seeing less and less usage, and it's mainly because Hoyoverse has been introducing more and more enemies that are resistant to Venti's burst, such as very heavy enemies or bosses. In fact, in regards to a lot of the harder content in Genshin Impact, such as Spiral Abyss Floor 12, it has been extremely boss focused, which unfortunately makes Venti's burst a lot less valuable. Now, does this make him useless? Definitely not. Even without the crowd controlling aspect of his burst, he still deals a lot of damage and can swirl and shred enemies' resistances. So I think that those that say that Venti is trash are definitely a bit misguided. However, that being said, it does make sense why there has been a huge shift in the meta towards characters like Sucrose and Kazuha whenever dealing with heavier enemies, because not only can they provide a little bit of crowd control here and there, but more importantly, they can boost your overall damage by increasing your elemental mastery or your elemental bonus damage, which is unfortunately something that Venti can't do without the help of external sources. But does this necessarily make Sucrose or Kazuha better than Venti? I don't personally think so, because they all shine in different situations. But before we get into one-on-one comparisons between these characters, I want to go over Venti's kit so that you can have a better understanding of what he does. So let's go ahead and start with his normal and charge attacks. Venti's normal attacks have a 6-hit attack string that all deal physical damage, while his charge shot fires off a single animo infused arrow, or 3 if you have his Constellation 1. I'm gonna go ahead and be honest with you guys, you probably shouldn't even level these up. I feel as though the grand majority of people that play Venti aren't going to be using him as a main damage dealer, so 9 times out of 10 using resources for this talent probably is just going to be a waste of resources. This is because the majority of Venti's value comes directly from his elemental skill and burst, so anytime that his elemental skill or burst are on cooldown, you want to be swapping to another character instead of using your normal and charge attacks. The only exception to this is if you are using Venti as a main damage dealer, but since the grand majority of players use him as a support unit, my general advice is to just ignore this talent altogether, or maybe level it up to level 6 and don't go any further. His elemental skill, on the other hand, is definitely something that you should be maxing out as soon as possible. I think that a lot of players actually really underestimate just how powerful his elemental skill can be, because even the press variant at talent level 10 deals almost 500% damage scaling. On top of this, the press variant only has a 6-second cooldown and generates 3 animo particles per use. It can also auto-target enemies that are close and at a distance, and with his Constellation 2 can be a source of anemo and physical shred. And like I said, that's all just the press variant. The hold variant creates an even larger circle and deals even more damage. However, to be fair, in battle, a lot of players choose not to use this version, simply because it has a longer casting animation as well as a longer cooldown. But if you are building him with crit in mind, it does deal up to 684% damage scaling at talent level 10, meaning that if you have enough enemies grouped up, you might be able to take them out with his skill alone. And while not practical in all situations, his hold skill can also create an updraft, which makes it possible for any character to deal plunging damage, even if they might have not been able to otherwise. However, the thing that most players use his hold skill for is actually exploration. There are so many many times in Genshin Impact where you just wish that you could get a little bit higher, whether it's to reach an Oculus, solve a puzzle, or find a chest. And characters that make this easier to do are actually pretty few and far between. The only two characters that can really compete with Venti in regards to upward mobility are Keqing with her teleport and Kazuha with his skill. And I really can't emphasize enough just how much better these characters make world exploration, because anytime I'm doing any exploring, I always make sure that I have at least one of these characters in my team. However, the true star and highlight of Venti's kit is 100% his elemental burst. His elemental burst summons a giant anemo vortex that pulls in and immobilizes small enemies, rendering them absolutely helpless. His burst can also affect some mid-sized enemies by pulling them closer to its center, making it much easier to hit multiple enemies at one time. The suction from Venti's burst directly scales off of his character level in relation to the level of your enemies, meaning that the higher your level and the lower their level, the more your enemies will be affected by the vortex. This offers both positives and negatives, but we'll get into that a little bit more during the team synergy section. His elemental burst can deal up to 20 anemo slashes, deals additional elemental damage of whatever element is swirled into his burst, and on top of all of that raw damage, it can swirl as well. Besides Xiao, I think that Venti has the strongest anemo burst in the game currently, because if positioned correctly, it can whittle away enemies' health bars in a matter of seconds. And on top of excellent crowd control and great damage, once you unlock Venti's second passive, you also get 15 energy back directly after using his burst, essentially cutting his initial burst cost of 60 down to 45. But that's not all, because it also generates 15 energy particles for whatever element was infused in his burst. So let's say that you infuse Venti's burst with a pyro attack. This means that not only will Venti be getting back 15 energy for his own burst, but all pyro characters in your party will be refunded 15 energy for their burst respectively, making Venti one of the best batteries in the game, so long as you're pairing him up with pyro, cryo, hydro, or electro characters. However, despite Venti's burst being absolutely amazing, there are certain instances when it does have its drawbacks. For example, while Venti's burst is absolutely amazing for small and mid-sized enemies, many players, including myself, find it very frustrating when fighting boss-type enemies or enemies that are too heavy to be affected by Venti's burst, because if enemies do move, then you're losing out on a lot of damage, and since you're not getting any of the perks from crowd controlling, you might find yourself wondering why you didn't slot in a completely different character instead of Venti. In addition to this, Venti's burst can sometimes be a little bit hard to aim, causing his burst to be set up in a location that isn't optimal, which can end up ruining your rotations, leading to lower clear times, or you just restarting the trial altogether. These are problems that you can work around by learning enemies' attack patterns and learning how to properly distance yourself away from enemies, but I would be lying if I didn't say that it was a little bit frustrating, especially when characters like Sucrose and Kazuha don't deal with this nearly as much. So essentially, in the right circumstances, it's extremely powerful, and so powerful that it's almost OP, but whenever he's facing against an enemy that hard counters his burst, it's almost better not to use him at all and instead bring another character. This isn't me trying to dissuade anyone from getting him, I just want to let you guys know what you need to expect. Okay, but now that we've gone over Venti's kit, let's talk about weapon choices. First and foremost, in terms of 5 stars, we have his best in slot, the Elegy of the End. It boasts a high base attack of 608, gives you 55.1% energy recharge at level 90, and after hitting enemies with your skill or burst 4 times, at R1 it gives 100 elemental mastery to the entire party, as well as a 20% attack boost. This is 100% Venti's best option in terms of supporting capability, and seems to be Hoyoverse's way of making Venti a buffer without actually touching his kit. Venti's next best option, and actually his best option if you're going for a crit build, is his original signature weapon, the Skyward Harp. Not only does it have the highest base attack of any bow currently in Genshin Impact, 674 at level 90, but it also provides an additional 22.1% crit rate, 20% crit damage, and a 60% chance to deal additional physical damage anytime that you hit an enemy. When looking at all Refinement Rank 1 bows, this definitely comes out on top. The Polar Star is also a decent option, but a little bit convoluted in order to get all of its buffs, but it is a great stat stick, so if you already have it, then it's definitely a viable option. Thundering Pulse and Amos Bow are also decent stat sticks, but they're definitely better on other characters, so I don't recommend them for Venti. However, luckily you don't actually need a 5-star bow in order to make Venti shine. In fact, one of his absolute best bows is the Stringless, and with refinements it can actually outpace 5-star options, because at R5 it can give you an insane 48% damage boost to your elemental skill skill and elemental burst. On top of this, it does boost your elemental mastery, which is one of Venti's most coveted stats, making this weapon an absolute standout in regards to endgame viability. However, if you don't have the stringless but you do have the Windbloom Ode, then this is definitely a great free-to-play option. Not only does it also give you an elemental mastery substat, but anytime you use your elemental skill, you can increase your attack by 32% at refinement rank 5. The only problem is that this was a limited weapon during the Windbloom Festival, so unfortunately if you didn't play during that event, then you're out of luck. Okay, but let's say that you don't have either of these options. You can always use the Battle Pass weapon, which is an excellent weapon on him if you want to go for a crit build, plus it provides you with even more crowd control so long as you hit enemies with your normal and charge attacks every once in a while. Or if you randomly have the Alley Hunter, it's actually a pretty decent option on him considering that he's not on the field that often, making it pretty easy to achieve max stacks in order to boost his damage. But let's say that you're completely free to play, you didn't play during the Windbloom Festival, and you haven't gotten lucky and gotten the stringless, then you still have a decent option with the Favonius bow. This bow is completely free and you get it during the Mondstadt story quest, so it's really easy to get your hands on, and on top of that it is a decent option since it does provide Venti with extra energy, while providing even more energy particles for the rest of your team. So all in all, a great free-to-play option. Moving on, let's go ahead and talk about his artifacts. There's really just one and very clear choice, the full 4-piece set of the Viridescent Venereer. Not only does it give you a 15% increase to your animo damage, but way more importantly, it increases your swirl damage by 60% and decreases opponents' elemental resistance to the element that's infused in the swirl by 40% for 10 seconds. It has been stated time and time again that this is one of the best artifact sets in the game, so as long as you're swirling enemies with different elemental reactions, this is definitely your best choice. However, in regards to stats, Venti's actually a special case where you can build him two separate ways. You can either build him with a crit build, where you give him an attack sand, an animo goblet, and a crit circlet, or you can go for a full elemental mastery build, where you give him an EM sand, EM goblet, and EM circlet in order to maximize on his swirl damage. It has been found that his EM build does do slightly more damage, but in all honesty, both builds are completely viable, so I just recommend going with whatever pieces are best on your account, and even if you end up going for a hybrid build, that's perfectly fine because it still does a decent amount of damage. Alright, but what about Constellations? Venti's one of the only characters that I don't really recommend going for Constellations unless you really love him. I would only consider one of his Constellations outright bad, and some of his Constellations are actually pretty good. I just don't think that they add a whole lot to his kit, and I definitely don't think that they're worth the primos if you have another character that you're saving up for. But for the sake of us all being on the same page, let's quickly go over them. His first Constellation is the one that I actually think is pretty bad. All it does is give you 2 additional arrows anytime that you use his charge attack. This sounds good in theory, but in practice, since his charge attacks aren't really used much in battle anyway, many players won't really utilize this Constellation except for maybe popping balloons. So in my opinion, 100% not worth it. His Constellation 2 on the other hand is actually pretty decent. It makes it so that when you do hit an enemy with his elemental skill, that it will reduce the enemy's resistance to animo and physical damage by 12%. Enemies that are also knocked up by his elemental skill will have their animo and physical resistance reduced by another 12% on top of that. So 24% if you can manage to do both. This is nice since this is one of the only ways that you can actually get animo shred, but you still have to take into consideration whether or not it's worth sacrificing 2 other 5 stars in order to get it. Constellation 3 is nice since it does give you an additional 3 talent levels to his burst, which is his main source of damage. Constellation 4 makes it so that whenever you pick up an energy particle that you get an additional 25% anemo bonus damage, which is definitely a nice boost to his overall damage, but probably isn't worth going for Constellations in. His Constellation 5 increases his skill talent by 3 levels, and while very few players will ever reach this point, I do have to admit that his Constellation 6 definitely is his best Constellation, because not only does it provide an additional 20% animo resistance shred whenever your burst hits an enemy, but it also makes it so that if an elemental absorption occurred, then enemies' resistance towards that corresponding element will also be decreased by 20%. So not only will you be increasing Venti's damage, but you'll also be increasing the damage from your main DPS so long as you're swirling their element. It's definitely a pretty good Constellation. My only problem is that it's all the way at C6, meaning that you'll have to summon him 7 times in order to get it, meaning that you'll have to give up 7 characters in order to get this ability. So taking a look at things objectively, I don't think that any of his Constellations are really worth gunning for, since they're essentially just damage buffs, rather than being anything that changes his gameplay. However, if you really love Venti and you want him to be the best of the best and min-maxed, then feel free to do whatever you want, because only you are gonna know what's best for you and what you can afford. Alright, and before we get into the final verdict of whether or not he's worth it, let's quickly go over his team synergies. The nice thing about Venti is that since he's a Nemo and very flexible in terms of build, he can actually fit into just about any team comp. You can build him for elemental mastery whenever dealing with elemental reactions, and even if you wanted to put him on a double Geo team, you can instead just use him for crowd control and build him with a crit rate build. Venti's one of those rare characters where the options are pretty much endless. He can fit into melt comps, he can fit into electrocharge comps, he can fit into freeze comps, he can make overload comps viable because he's able to pull in enemies, he can work in mono pyro comps. It really just comes down to what characters that you already have and how you want to build your teams around them. However, keep in mind that while he is very flexible as a unit, there are still some characters that don't really pair that well with him, strictly because they struggle to hit enemies while inside Venti's burst. For example, while a character like Yoimiya will have no problems hitting enemies while airborne, characters like Hu Tao are really going to struggle to hit their normal and charge attacks, since they just don't reach that high. So while you technically can run Venti on a team comp with Hu Tao, you'd probably want to use Sucrose or Kazuha instead, simply because they keep enemies closer to the ground. Other characters that might struggle a little bit are characters like Noelle, Diluc, Kuching, Xiangling, Eula, and Xiao. So try to keep in mind whether or not you think that your characters are going to be able to reach Venti's burst. However, that being said, characters that do have good synergy with this burst really take things to the next level. For example, eclipsing Ayaka's burst on top of Venti's burst basically ensures that any enemy caught in between the two is going to be deleted. Same goes for characters like the Raiden Shogun, Yaemiko, Mona, Child, Klee, Zhongli, and Arataki Ito, who can actually hit enemies with his charge attacks since they have such a high AoE. And let's not forget that Ganyu and Albedo both deal quadratic scaling whenever you pair their bursts with Venti's burst, which can lead to some pretty insane damage over time. And it's looking like Ayato will probably have the same synergy considering his burst works in a similar way. And despite Child having quadratic scaling all on his own, Venti makes it much easier to group up enemies so that they take as much Riptide damage as possible. And while some might find it a little bit excessive, you can actually pair Venti with either Sucrose or Kazuha for an even more insane amount of crowd control while also boosting your entire team's damage output. Overall, Venti is an extremely flexible character, so as long as you're pairing him with characters that can still hit inside of his burst, you really can't go wrong. I don't really want to spend too much time on each individual team that Venti can fit into, mainly because I think that'll just make this video too long, but if you guys are interested in a top teams video for Venti, please feel free to let me know down in the comments. But for now, let's move on to the next and final segment of the video, whether or not Venti is actually still worth it. This one was pretty tough to judge since I know that a lot of people are tight on primos, but I think that I finally came to the conclusion that Venti is still worth it and is still an excellent character, but if you don't already have Kazuha and you're stuck between choosing between the two, I think that Kazuha is the better option. This isn't because Venti is bad, it's just that Kazuha is better in more situations, and I think that it's actively harder for Hoyoverse to nerf Kazuha compared to Venti. However, that being said, Hoyoverse does seem to still love Venti. He is the Anemo Archon after all, so I never think that Venti's going to completely fall out of the meta, and instead he'll ebb and flow in terms of usefulness. Whenever dealing with hordes of small enemies, he's always going to be the number one choice, and in any other circumstance he's still going to be a decent one. I think that a lot of people underestimate just how valuable it is to have at least 2 Anemo Swirlers, so that you can have a Nemo Shred and crowd control on both sides of the abyss. So even if you already have Sucrose or Kazuha, picking up Venti might not be a bad idea. Ultimately, I think that if you want Venti, you should go ahead and pull for him because he's still a fantastic unit and has aged phenomenally since the very beginning of the game. For example, while Klee and Diluc were both considered to be top tier units, both have fallen off considerably over time. But despite being the very first limited character, Venti is still heavily used in today's current meta because while a little bit more circumstantial, when he's the best, he's still the best. So go ahead and summon if you want to bring your drunken bard home. Alright guys, and that's all that I have to say about Venti for right now. However, if you guys do want to see a direct comparison between Venti or Kazuha or a Venti team comp video, please feel free to let me know down in the comments, cause I'll try to see what I can do. Or if you have questions about Ayaka, I did make an Is She Worth It video that you can go check out on my channel. I'll make sure to leave a link both in the description below as well as the pinned comment. And like always, if you did enjoy the video, please feel free to leave me a like, hit that subscribe button, and click that notification bell. That way you don't miss a new video whenever it comes out. But anyway, that's all for now. So until next time, best wishes. Bye.